What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so this is a requested video from my subscribers. They want me to do a comparison between Don Nelson and Larry Brown. Right? At one point in time, Don Nelson was the all-time winningest coach. He took over that title from Lenny Wilkens. I forget what year it was, but it was sometime in the 2000s, I believe. Don Nelson coached something around 35 years. I believe from 1976 or so to about 2010. I think he took 1 year off. So he coached about 33 years, I guess. When you look at his resume, 3-time coach of the year, 2-time he was the All-Star game head coach. Back in 1998, he was listed as one of the top 10 coaches in NBA history. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2022, when they updated and revised this list, he still was on that list, but the list had been expanded to the top 15 coaches of all time. His regular season record is 1,335 victories versus 1,063 defeats for a 55.7% win percentage. However, in the postseason, his win percentage plummets to just 45.2%, a 75-91 overall record. He won the championship as an assistant. I think he was the assistant coach in the FIBA World Championship back in Toronto back in 1994. 10 times, Nelly's teams missed the playoffs. He was 0-4 in the conference finals in his coaching career. Although, to be fair, those losses came against some all-time great teams. The 83 76ers, I don't need to go far into that. The 84 Celtics, the 86 Celtics, considered by some the greatest team of all time, although some will say it's the 83 Sixers. And remember back in 2003, when he was coaching the Dallas Mavericks, they lost to the San Antonio Spurs. That was the last championship David Robinson won. Last team that Steve Kerr was an active player on. I think they lost that series 4-2, but at one point in time, I think they were up 2-1 before Dirk Nowitzki suffered an injury. So if Dirk doesn't get hurt, maybe Nelly wins a title. Who knows? Probably, because I think that if they had beaten the Spurs, I think they probably would have beaten the Knicks, just from a talent standpoint. Don Nelson is in many ways the complete opposite of Larry Brown. Don Nelson coached what they call Nelly ball. And Don Nelson emphasized offense more than defense. Though, when he coached the Milwaukee Bucks in the 80s, he had some great defenders on that team. And I've always said that the Milwaukee Bucks were the best team in the NBA in the 80s not to make it to an NBA Finals. So those were some good defensive teams. But generally speaking, Nelly ball emphasizes small ball. So it's, in many ways, a precursor to the NBA of today. But much like the NBA today, playing purely small ball doesn't work very well in the postseason. We see with Mike D'Antoni, when the game slows down and teams get more serious as far as playing defense, the game becomes a little bit more half court, or at least, very least, the players get a little bit more serious on the defensive end. Some of the critics of Nelly ball say that, look, number one, when you're playing at such a rapid pace throughout the game, that's going to take away from you on the defensive end. Okay, you're going to get tired, and that is often what happened with Don Nelson teams during the course of a series, or in the course of a playoff run. Don Nelson's teams, before I even say teams, Don Nelson pretty much created and just, what's the word I'm looking for? Invented the point forward position. Back in the late 1970s, the first time that term was ever really used was for what's his name? Oh boy, Marquise Johnson. Although you could argue that Rick Barry was playing that position with the Warriors during their time, but they didn't use that term back then. Sorry for that. I had a little bit of a distraction. Had to mute the mic. Hope you can hear me. I just like, what happened to the audio? So what was I saying now? Yeah, so Don Nelson is considered the inventor or the man who created the point forward position. But as I said before, as fun as exciting as Nelly ball could be, he had to have the right personnel for that. Another thing too about Nelly ball is that it didn't really emphasize the front court players. Um, Generally speaking, if you're playing small ball, that leaves a deficiency in the front court. Um, so while you have guys who can score, um, it creates a mismatch as far as size and depth, especially back then when power forwards and centers still played traditional basketball. Another thing too is in the nights where players aren't making their shots, Don Nelson's teams were prone to getting blown out. Larry Brown, on the other hand, was a coach who emphasized defense much more and the fundamentals much more than Don Nelson. When you look at his teams, the Sixers back in 2001, even though Allen Iverson was the focal point offensively, he was surrounded by great defensive players and some dogs, you know what I'm saying? Um, the Pistons, defensive team, obviously one of the great defensive teams of all times. Even the Pacers, who Larry Brown coached in the 90s. Although we think of Reggie Miller and he was a great scorer, but they were more or less a hard-nosed, defensive-oriented team. And that was kind of the style of the Eastern Conference, to be honest with you, back in those days. The Western Conference was a little bit more high octane offensively for that era, but the East was definitely more defensive oriented, more half court basketball. I enjoyed watching Larry Brown's teams more. I may be in a minority, but I like defense. I've always liked defense because it's when you're playing against a hard-nosed, tough defense that you really get to see who's the real scorers, rather than when everything is wide open and people like J.J. Redick can look like all-stars. Larry Brown's resume: NBA champion, of course, 2004 with the Detroit Pistons. He won the Coach of the Year award with the Sixers back in 2001. He was a 3-time All-Star head coach. In the ABA, 2-time All-Star head coach in the NBA. 3 times he was the ABA Coach of the Year. And a couple of years ago, he was named one of the top 15 coaches of all time. When you combine his ABA and NBA record, 1,327 victories versus 1,011 losses for a 56.8% win percentage. His playoff career combined ABA and NBA. He coached in the ABA for quite a few years. His combined ABA-NBA records 120 and 115 for a 51.1% win percentage. 5 times in his career, he missed the postseason. If you include just the NBA, he reached the conference finals in 1978 coaching the Denver Nuggets. They lost to the eventual champion Portland Trailblazers. In 94, when he was coaching the Pacers, they lost to the Knicks, who would lose to the Rockets in 7 in the finals. In 95, when he was coaching the Pacers again, he lost in 7, once again, to the Orlando Magic, who would get swept by the Rockets. At ABA, he was coaching the name that damn team. Give me 1 second here. The Carolina Cougars, which makes sense because he was from North. I mean, he went to college in North Carolina. I think he was assistant coach in UNC. So he coached the Carolina Cougars, who was the ABA team, and they lost to the Kentucky Colonels in the 74 division finals, which was the equivalent of the conference finals. The Kentucky Colonels then went on to lose to the Pacers in the ABA finals. I think it was 7 games. The next year, 75, I think by that point in time, I think the next year he had moved over to become the coach of the Denver Nuggets when they were in the ABA. They lost the divisional finals to the Kentucky Colonels. So he lost to them again. He was just different on a different. He was the head coach for a different team this time, and they went on to win it all that year in 1975. That's the team that had Artis Gilmore and Dan Essel. All right. So as far as international, Larry Brown, I'm just going to mention this, as a player in 1964, won the Olympic gold in Tokyo. This is when only amateurs could play. This is when he was playing with guys like, I think, Jim Barnes, Luke Jackson, Walt Hazzard, Bill Bradley, who went on to win titles with the Knicks and went on to become a longtime senator for the state of New Jersey, ran for president back in 2000. He won the Olympic gold. Won Olympic gold as an assistant coach in 2000 in Sydney. He was the head coach in 2004 for the ill-fated team in Athens, the only won the bronze. But he did win the FIBA Americas Championship in 2003 in San Juan as a head coach, and won the Olympic gold representing the United States in the Maccabiah Games in 1961 in Israel. Who's the better coach, man? In my opinion, man, I give the nod to Larry Brown. Larry Brown, I think, was that coach that would go to a specific team and he would elevate that team. Now, he couldn't, because of his personality, because of the way he would sometimes rub his player the wrong way, he had a short shelf life. Sometimes players he wore out his welcome eventually. It could be abrasive. So he couldn't stay in destinations too long. But he definitely elevated teams when he went to these specific teams. Look, when he was coaching, let's start with because he started actually coaching in college. He was an assistant a couple years in North Carolina, 65 to 67, but he became the head coach of the Carolina Cougars. And in his second year, they went to the division finals, which is the equivalency of the conference finals. His first year with the Denver Nuggets as the head coach, when he was still in the ABA, he went to the division finals again, losing to the eventual champion Colonels. When they moved over to the NBA in 1976, well, his second year, they go to the conference finals, losing to the eventual champion Portland Trailblazers. Then he goes to UCLA. I think he succeeded John Wooden there, if I'm not mistaken. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Then he coaches the Nets for a while, from 81 to 83. Then he goes to Kansas. Now, I didn't talk about this, but some of the greatest collegiate teams of all time were under Don Nelson, specifically the 85-86 team from a talent perspective, though he won the National College Championship with Kansas and Danny Manning as the star player back in 1988. But I didn't mention that because it's the NBA. Then he became the head coach of the Spurs from 88 to 92. That team had a lot of success. They didn't win a title, didn't go to a finals, but they were good. Then he coached the Clippers 92-93, turned that team around. And then I think they went to playoffs in 93, if I'm not mistaken. And he coached the Pacers from 93-97. That was a great turnaround. They went to the conference finals 2 years in a row, 94 and 95. And then he went to coach the Sixers from 97 to 2003. They did the turnaround, went from being a team only winning 20-something games to winning, to getting all the way to the NBA Finals and being the only team to beat the 2001 Lakers in the postseason. Then he goes to the Detroit Pistons in 2003, a team that nobody really saw on the radar. In his first year, he wins a championship there. Now, he did have some dismal performances. The Knicks, that one season, I remember, was disastrous. I think they only won. Didn't they win only like 17 games that year? Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they had a disastrous season. And his team with the Charlotte Bobcats wasn't that great. But more often than not, Larry Brown turned teams around. He turned teams around. And he was a good damn player, too. When he played in the ABA, he was an ABA champion in 1969 with the Oakland Oaks, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was the Oakland Oaks. He was a 3-time ABA All-Star for 3 consecutive years. He was the All-Star in the 1968. He was the MVP of the All-Star game in the ABA in 1968. 3-time ABA assist leader, All-ABA second team in 1968. And his first team All-ACC in 63 and second team All-ACC in 62. So he was a really good player. Don Nelson was a solid player, but I would give the edge to Larry Brown, man. Won the championship. You know what I'm saying? Won the championship. 2 NBA final appearances. Don Nelson can never get to the NBA finals. Don Nelson has more wins, technically, in the NBA. But when you combine the ABA and the NBA, Larry Brown's performances with these teams were just more impressive. He did more. Don Nelson had a lot of talent on his teams. You know what I'm saying? And when he did not have the right personnel, like with the Knicks in 95-96, it was disastrous. And then later on, as he got older, a lot of his teams started underperforming. So I would give the edge to Larry Brown, man. I think Don Nelson's a great coach, but sometimes I get the impression he's a little bit overrated. A little bit. When I say overrated, I don't mean bad. He sucks. He's still a great, great coach, but sometimes people put him like in the top 3, top 4, and I don't see that. I see Don Nelson as a top maybe 10 coach, but toward the bottom. Matter of fact, people talk so much about, Doc Rivers being overrated, but I would rate Doc Rivers over Don Nelson. Doc Rivers has a title. So anyway, that's my take, man. I put Larry Brown ahead of him. Tell me what you guys think.